Hi, I'm Aruna.
And I'm Shankar.
We're desperate parents. We have a high schooler at home who doesn't know what career choice he should make. And like all teenagers, he communicates only in grunts and shrugs. So we decided we'll have to do the talking. In this podcast series, we'll interview experts from various fields and ask them questions that takes you into their life, gives you a sense of what their work is really like and how their field is developing.
So one week we could be speaking with someone who teaches aerospace engineering, the next week with a practicing lawyer, and the third with the head of a research lab. And we plan to go beyond these conventional career choices. For example, who wouldn't want to hear the life story of the chef at a five-star restaurant, how he got where he got, for example.
And along the way, we'll also share a nugget or two about decision making, maybe a tool or a mental model that helps while making any choice. We hope this will be useful.
Hi everyone, our guest today is Professor Sunil Amrit. Welcome, Professor Amrit. He's the Henry R. Luce Director of the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Yale Area Studies at Yale. I'll read this out just so that I get it absolutely right. And also the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History and Professor in the School of Environment at Yale. He's the author of 4 books and has received many awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship and the 2024 Fukuoka Prize for Outstanding Achievements in the Field of Asian Studies. He grew up in Singapore and lives in Connecticut. Professor Amrit, Sunil, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sunil, if I might start by asking you about the whole field of arts and humanities. As you know, in India, there is a tendency to focus more on the so-called professional courses, medicine, engineering, chartered accountancy, and the like. So tell us, for our listeners, why should my child study humanities?
Let me start with the intrinsic reason why I think your child should study the humanities. At the broadest possible level, the humanities delve into what gives meaning to our human lives. And I think that the humanities, as a grounding for a lifelong exploration of questions of meaning and of value, serves all of us well, whatever fields we go into in the future. So I think that's an intrinsic reason. I also think there is a more substantive, practical reason, which is to say that if you look at the world around us, if we think about what is changing our world, yes, technology looms very large in that. But some of the forces changing our world actually can't be grasped with a technical or professional education. The forces changing our world are age-old forces of warfare and ethnic and religious conflict. The destabilization all around us is as much driven by the kinds of developments, the kinds of conflicts that the humanities really do sort of specialize in studying as much as anything else. And I think that's what's so puzzling about the world that we live in, that so much that's going on around the world, so much of the suffering that we see around us feels ancient. And therefore, I think there is something about the capacity of the humanities to illuminate the world we're living in, not necessarily to predict where we're going next, but to understand that actually some of these forces are deeply rooted in the ways that different human societies interact with one another.
Yeah. So this lack of focus also means I'm an art student, and I've observed that people tend to take specializations in technical areas or in science very seriously, but they tend to lump arts, humanities, social sciences into one bucket. For our listeners, could you explain what each of these mean and how they should think differently about each of these?
I think that's a really good point. And I might think of them as a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the quantitative social sciences. And I think most Indian students would be most likely to encounter the far end of that spectrum, which is the discipline of economics. Political science is more and more actually styling itself in that way as well. And these are social science disciplines which are increasingly quantitative and which are also, we call them universalizing social sciences, which is to say that they assume that the laws of human behavior that they model apply regardless of context. And then I think at the very other end of the scale, you have the creative arts, which are so much about the individual imagination, which are about individual expression. And I see history, my own discipline, as really somewhere right in the middle. And one of the things that's very interesting is even if I just look at the institutions where I have taught in my career, in some places, history is considered a social science. In some places, it's considered a humanities subject. Mm-hmm. And what draws me to history is, of course, it is that capaciousness. The largest level, history is about the study of the human past. But of course, that includes so many different ways of understanding the past, from the branch of history that's really quite close to literature, which is about studying texts, excavating language, from there to the part of history, economic history, which is very closely aligned with the discipline of economics, which is looking for long-term trajectories of economic change over time. So I think it is important to see the arts, humanities, and social sciences as distinct, but also in some ways along a continuum, because there's a lot of fuzzy boundaries between these subjects as well.
So I'll just follow that up with a kind of brass tacks question for kids looking to study humanities and their parents looking for admissions. What are the career options for those who major in humanities? If you could take history first and then maybe speak to it more generically.
I think that does vary from country to country. And I think this is where there is a distinction between the West, if we can call it that, and Asia, and India in particular. Because I think there has historically been a tradition in the US, the UK, perhaps in Europe, of highly valuing humanities education regardless of career field. So what I've seen in my career, I've taught in the UK, I've taught in the US, history graduates go on to do everything. They go on to work in investment banking and management consultancy. They go on to law school. They go on to public policy jobs. They go into teaching. They go into nonprofits. They go into activism. There's almost no field that I have not seen my own students go into. I'm not sure that is as true in India or in other parts of Southeast Asia, including Singapore, where I grew up. There, I think there is a little bit more of a straight line between certain professional qualifications and the kinds of careers that students can follow. But I have a sense, too, that things are changing. I mean, 10 minutes into our conversation, we have to talk about AI. We have to talk about how dramatically that is changing the landscape of careers that face young people. And so many of the skills that even 10 years ago were highly valued human skills can increasingly competently be done by artificial intelligence now. And what I think that does, it's interesting because those skills are actually fairly evenly distributed across scientific and technical fields and humanities fields. I mean, it's true in writing. It's also true in coding. I saw an essay in Science magazine just today about sort of increasingly sophisticated quantitative reasoning that large reasoning models can undertake, sometimes maybe even up to the level of PhD scientists. So in a sense, there is an alarming, if you want to put it that way, sense that so many of the skills that we've fostered over generations are maybe less valuable than they used to be. What that means, I think, is that the skills that will be most valued in the future are those that are most distinctively human, if I can put it that way. And I wouldn't be surprised if actually that brings back a certain emphasis onto some of the skills that humanities will teach. So, for example, I've seen to me, compelling evidence that as we move into a world where AI is doing more and more, we will likely see a resurgence in the value of live performance, whether that is a theater performance or whether that is the ability to speak in public. That individual voice, the ability to express one's own story in a way that, in a sense, no technology can do for us. And so I wouldn't be surprised if actually some of the attributes of a humanities education open the way to a series of careers which perhaps we can't even quite envisage at the moment, at a moment of such rapid change.
So you touched upon something which we were going to ask you about, the impact of AI. So do you believe the impact of AI on sciences will be much greater than on humanities, inevitably on multiple skills, But delving into the humanities, even for a science major, do you think that's an important thing for their professional life because it develops certain types of competencies?
I think that may be a good way of putting it. I think what the humanities teaches is actually individual expression. As much as any specific technical skill, it is the ability to articulate one's own view of the world at the largest possible scale. And I think that is a skill or a set of skills which will serve scientists very well, which will serve accountants very well. As we move into a world where more and more of the technical stuff may well be done by technology for us.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So I have this current affairs type question now. The US education system has always stood for excellence in teaching and research. Are you concerned that there are any changes stemming from the current political situation there?
I'm profoundly concerned. I think the assault on science and on universities and on research and on scholarship in just the last 6 to 8 weeks is so profound that I can honestly say I think that within a fairly short period of time, the US may lose all of the preeminence that it has had for decades, and justifiably so in many ways, in the fields of research, science, scholarship. I am fortunate to be at a leading research university in the US, and the kinds of pressures that we are under in terms of sudden slashing of government funding for science, in terms of the suspension of programs like the Fulbright Fellowship programs, which have brought so much academic exchange to this country and indeed allowed Americans to go all over the world to learn and to share ideas. The politicization of the attack on education, indeed, a questioning by the current government of the very value of universities. All of that, I think, in a quite shockingly short period of time, could lead to a real collapse of all that has been most valuable in the American education system. Now, if I were to step back and take a global perspective, I think other countries, other societies will fill that gap. Because there are many places in the world, both in Asia and in Europe, where it's inconceivable that governments would stop funding science. That, in fact, there's an expansion of universities, that there has been no turning away from the idea that university education is valuable. And I think that those systems, those societies, those institutions will step in to fill the gaps that I think are likely to sort of be faced in the global academic world by what's happening here in the United States. The recent survey in Nature magazine suggested that something like 70% of young scientists that they interviewed are considering leaving the US.
So just to take that a few centimeters further, what's your advice to Indian students now gearing up to apply? This year's batch, for example.
If I were advising my own family members, I would certainly say, think carefully about coming to the US. I would say there are other options out there, including in India. I'd say that there is just a huge amount of uncertainty about how things are going to pan out here. I'm an optimist by nature. I continue to believe that there is a certain resilience in especially the large research universities. I have a lot of confidence in the efforts that are undergoing to use the courts to band together to try to sort of stem some of this. There are, of course, also very capricious changes coming to visa regulations. A lot of international scholars are being turned back at the border when they arrive in the US. So it's a profoundly concerning time. And I would certainly say, I hope this turbulence subsides or eases off at some point. If I were applying right now, I would certainly be thinking twice. I would be looking at options in India. I would be looking at Singapore. I would be looking at Europe, Australia, places where there isn't quite the instability that we are facing here at the moment.
Thanks.
So this question of geopolitics and migration, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this. A lot of the migration, and you've done a lot of work in that area, a lot of the migration that we saw from India in 60s, 70s, 80s, I mean, the past several decades has been economic migration primarily. There could be other reasons going forward, ecological, for cultural identity reasons, perhaps even your convictions. So when high school students today get into the workplace a few years down the line, um, they would not automatically be thinking of let's settle in the US perhaps, or should they be? How should they be thinking about where they should live?
I think that in some ways is the most existential question that many of us face. And I think even if we look at the last 50, 60 years of migration, I think, of course, one of the things that's very clear is that not everybody has the same possibilities of migration. And if anything, I think those inequalities have got sharper over time, which is to say that, particularly the opportunity of long-distance international migration in order to seek better opportunities, including educational opportunities, those have always been restricted to a fairly, not small, but nevertheless fairly privileged section of society. Whereas at the same time, those with the fewest resources are also migrating, often forced to migrate. But these are very different kinds of journeys. They tend to be domestic. They tend to be sort of over shorter distances, perhaps more cyclical or seasonal, and with far fewer options. And I think that's only getting sharper as visa regulations are becoming tighter all over the world. Borders are becoming far more impermeable. And even for those with a lot of skills, with a lot of education, it's becoming very difficult to move to some parts of the world, which perhaps might have been a little bit easier a generation or so ago. So I think the first thing I would say is that the landscape is changing, and that the routes of migration, which we have become used to, for example, taking skilled professionals from India to the US, they may look very different in a few years' time. It's very interesting, for example, to see how much skilled Indian migration has oriented itself towards places like Singapore and Australia over the last 10 years or so, both of which have seen very, very sharp increases, perhaps at the expense of the US. We've seen a lot of return migration from Silicon Valley back to Bangalore and other places. And I think that it's just going to become more multi-directional, more complicated. My own sense, for what it's worth, is that we have passed the heyday of the US being the sort of ultimate migrant destination that people aspire to. I think this society is so divided and so fractured that is bound to have a knock-on effect on its economic performance and on its attractiveness as a destination. There are also issues of public safety. If you think about the prevalence of firearms in this society, that itself is enough to turn many people towards other routes and other directions.
I just wanted to ask you a question on migration and identity.
Yeah.
The teenage years are a period when anyway, we're thinking about what our identity is and shaping our identity. To what extent, does the place you live in, where you want to go, where you want to study, that probably shapes our identity a lot. So what would you say to a high schooler in terms of shaping their identity?
I'd say, first of all, that really resonates with me. When I was a teenager growing up in Singapore, this was in the 1990s, at a time when, unlike now, where things have changed, at that time, the humanities were really not valued at all in Singaporean society and within the education system. And having realized as a teenager that those were the fields I was most drawn to, I had a sense that in order to pursue them, I needed to study overseas. And so I was oriented towards that, I think, from quite an early stage in my high school career. And I think that probably was part of my identity, not necessarily where in particular I wanted to go. I ended up in the UK, but I wouldn't say that in itself was an aspiration. But the idea that I was going to go out and study somewhere where the humanities were more valued. And it's been very interesting over the course of my career to see how much that's changed, that the UK, where I went to study, and the UK has been slashing humanities departments, underfunding them, whereas Singapore, which is the place I left, has invested hugely in the humanities and social sciences over the last decade or so. So I think we do see, so perhaps the advice is that build your identity perhaps on what you're most passionate about, what you want to pursue, while leaving open maybe the question of where you can do that, because that may change and that may change over time.
Wonderful. So, just wanted to ask you about your book, which we have here, and both of us have read different parts of it. Could you tell us what would be, for a high school student, what you would think would be the biggest takeaway from this book?
I think the biggest takeaway from the book is the book starts with a question: how did we reach this point of planetary crisis? And the biggest takeaway is that I think we need to think about two stories together. One is the path of need and one is the path of greed, because I think both of those forces have brought us to where we are. On the one hand, yes, this is about the disproportionate impact on the planet of a small minority of, first of all, Western societies, European imperialism, and then more recently, sort of the elites of the global South. So it's about the disproportionate impact of luxury consumption on the Earth, on its resources, on its ecosystems. There is a second story which I think is equally important, which is that this is a story of how the range of options and choices before the majority of human beings has just expanded vertiginously. And if we remember, life expectancy in India at independence was just over 30 years. And so in that sense, we can see this as a story of using the Earth's resources, albeit unsustainably, to widen in multiple ways the kinds of lives that we can live. I think we need to put those two stories together. And then we need to ask ourselves, well, what is truly essential? What do we value most? And can we pursue those goals in a less environmentally catastrophic way than we have done up till now?
Professor, we talked about identity, we talked about migration, we talked about the value of humanities. I want to ask a question which I think my son will probably ask, which is, what is that one cool thing about your job?
The cool thing about my job is I get to interact every day with the most creative young people, and they keep me on my toes. I learn something from them every day. And it means that no 2 days are the same. I mean, I think that's what I value most about my job. Every day is different because we are constantly having conversations on the biggest questions, like who are we? Where are we going? How did we get here? What kind of world do we want to live in? And it's a real privilege to have as my job, in a sense, the ability to have those conversations every day.
So as a professor, the cool thing about your job is interacting with young students.
Yeah, no doubt.
As a student of history, what would you say the coolest thing is?
You can time travel. You can traverse continents within 1 week. It's the capaciousness of the human past and the ability to just dive into societies that seem so distant from us. And yet, the deeper you go into those societies, the more you realize we actually have a lot to learn from the dilemmas, the choices, the beliefs of our ancestors, whether they're our own ancestors or our forebears in other continents of the world.
So thank you. Cyril, one final question for you. Bringing it all together and parking the US situation for a while, what would your words of advice be to the batch of 25 and the batch of 26?
I would say, don't lose sight of what really motivates you. Whatever field you want to go into, keep yourself open to making practical decisions, taking the steps you need to build your career, but not shutting down and narrowing too much down a single path. So always remain open. I think it need not even be what you do for your day job. Keep your interests alive, because I think they will sustain you long term, whatever it is that you actually do as a career path.
And sorry, just extending that a little bit further, UK versus US in normal times, I think you worked in both. For a student of the humanities, what are the relative advantages and disadvantages?
If I can bracket the current US situation, if I can pretend it's not happening, I would say that the US model of undergraduate education remains, from my point of view, the best I have seen, the best I have worked in, because of its breadth. in the US system. And I think I would love to see more of this culture, which I think is coming to India. Places like Ashoka and Kriya, there is a bit of a liberal arts culture, albeit in a small number of institutions. What is wonderful about this is that you can pursue anything you want, the sciences, without giving up the humanities. Many of the students who come and study history with me, they're not history majors. I don't need them to be history majors. They may be computer science majors. They may be economics majors. They may be physics majors. But the US approach to undergraduate education is such that everything nourishes everything else. And similarly, if you are a humanities major in the US, you can't give up the science. You have to keep a foot in that world. And so I do think that is a marvelous model of undergraduate education, in comparison to which I think the UK model is far too narrow and specialized. I'm not sure that at 18 you should just study history, which is what I did. Even if that is what you want to do, even if that is what you find most compelling, I think being a history major in a liberal arts context gives you just so much more breadth.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we close, there's something we'd like to share. In each episode, we're going to introduce a concept or a mental model to help with decision making. Since high schoolers have many decisions to make, we're hoping that they will find this helpful. Today, we'd like to talk about first principles.
What does reasoning from first principles mean? It simply means breaking down a problem or an issue into very basic elements by asking fundamental questions like why, what, or how. Typically, a musician or a chef would use first principles thinking on a regular basis, breaking down a dish or a piece of music into its foundational elements. This helps them understand the dish better, and it also helps them recombine these elements differently to arrive at a new dish or a piece of music. So whether you're trying to understand a physics concept or make a life decision, starting with first principles, breaking it down into simple, even silly questions, and working your way from there can be really helpful. So if you're deciding on what subject to take in college, ask yourself why you like that subject, why you want to go to a certain college, what you like about that subject. These may seem like very simplistic questions, but eventually you'll really get a lot of clarity, and it can also help you get creative. Give it a try.
Well, that's all we have today. So good luck and see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.